Imagine a cold, damp morning in May 1940. The air in northern France doesn't smell like spring. It smells like cordite, scorched earth, and the metallic tang of fear. You are a young soldier, barely old enough to shave, standing in a muddy ditch while the horizon vibrates with the roar of Panzer tanks. You were told the line would hold. You were told the British Expeditionary Force was invincible. But as the fog lifts, you see them. Thousands of gray uniforms, the sun glinting off bayonets, and the realization hits you like a physical blow. There is no escape. Not today. This is the moment your life as a free man ends, and your life as a number begins. Most men, when they feel the cold steel of a Luger pressed against their neck, feel their soul shrink. They accept the surrender. They march into the cages. But for one man, the moment the handcuffs clicked shut was not the end of the story. It was the start of the greatest game of hide-and-seek in human history. This is a story about a man who treated Nazi Germany like a revolving door. He was captured 7 times. He saw the inside of the most brutal high-security prisons the Third Reich could build. And yet 8 times he found a way to vanish into the night. They called him a ghost, a nuisance, and a legend. But to the Nazis, he was the one man they simply could not hold. To understand how he did it, we have to go back to that first taste of captivity. The year 1940 was a chaotic nightmare. The Allied forces were being pushed back toward the beaches of Dunkirk. In the confusion of the retreat, our protagonist found himself cut off from his unit. The adrenaline of combat is one thing, but the silence after a surrender is deafening. He was stripped of his rifle, his letters from home, and his dignity. Marched for days without food, he watched his comrades collapse from exhaustion, only to be left behind or worse. The German guards were triumphant, arrogant, and convinced that the war would be over by Christmas. They looked at their prisoners as broken cattle, but as he marched, he wasn't looking at his feet. He was looking at the gaps between the guards. He was counting the seconds it took for the searchlights to pivot. He was measuring the height of the barbed wire in his mind. While others prayed for the war to end, he was calculating the physics of a breakout. His first prison was little more than a makeshift holding pen, a converted factory surrounded by coils of razor wire and patrolled by men with submachine guns. The conditions were horrific. The soup was nothing more than boiled grass and sawdust. Disease began to rip through the barracks. The psychological weight of being a POW began to crush the spirit of the men around him. They became shadows of themselves, waiting for a miracle. He realized quickly that waiting for a miracle was a death sentence. He saw that the German military machine, while terrifyingly efficient, had one major flaw. It relied on rules, and rules can be studied. He spent weeks observing the routine of the camp. He noticed that at exactly 2:00 a.m., the guard shift changed, and for a window of exactly 90 seconds, the back perimeter near the latrines was left unmonitored. It was a tiny crack in the armor of the Reich, but it was all he needed. The night of his first escape was pitch black. A thunderstorm was rolling in, the heavy rain masking the sound of his movements. He crawled through the mud, his fingers bleeding as he pulled back a loose section of wire he had spent nights weakening with a smuggled piece of rusted metal. Every snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought the guards would hear it. He slid through the gap, the barbs tearing into his uniform, and for the first time in months he felt the grass of a forest under his boots instead of the gravel of a cage. He was out. He was a shadow in the woods, but the joy of freedom was short-lived. He was in the heart of occupied territory, hundreds of miles from friendly lines, with no map, no compass, and a stomach that hadn't seen a full meal in weeks. The Nazis didn't just have walls, they had an entire continent under their thumb. Every civilian could be an informant, every farmhouse a trap. He moved only at night, navigating by the stars, eating raw turnips stolen from fields. He made it 40 miles of pure, agonizing freedom, but the Nazis were relentless. They used bloodhounds to track his scent and motorcycles to cut off the roads. Eventually, cornered in an old barn and surrounded by a dozen soldiers with their rifles aimed at his chest, he had to put his hands up again. He was beaten, thrown into the back of a truck, and hauled back to a much darker, much more secure facility. The guards laughed as they threw him into a concrete cell. They told him he was lucky to be alive. They told him that nobody escapes twice. They were wrong. They thought they had captured a soldier, but they had actually captured a student. He had learned more in those 40 miles of freedom than he had in a year of training. He knew their patrol patterns. He knew how the dogs tracked. He knew that the impenetrable German border was just a series of puzzles waiting to be solved. As he sat in that dark cell, nursing his bruises, he wasn't weeping. He was smiling. Because he knew something the Nazis didn't. He had escaped once, and if he could do it once, he could do it again. The score was now 1-1. The real war, the war of wills, had just begun. After the first failed attempt, most men would have been broken. The German guards expected him to be. They threw him into a cold, windowless cell, reducing his rations to thin water and moldy bread, hoping the isolation would kill his spirit. But as he sat in the silence, he wasn't mourning his capture. He was conducting a post-mortem of his failure. He realized that his first escape had been an act of desperation, but his second would have to be an act of engineering. He was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a professional escape artist. The Nazis, frustrated by his defiance, decided to move him deeper into the heart of the Reich, to a high-security camp specifically designed for troublesome prisoners, men the Germans called Deutschfeindlich, or enemies of the German state. This new camp was a nightmare of architecture. It was a fortress of layered defenses, double-fenced perimeters with a death strip of raked sand in between, designed to show even the slightest footprint. There were towers every 50 yards equipped with MG-34 machine guns and powerful searchlights that swept the grounds with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. The guards here weren't the old reservists he had seen before. They were frontline troops, disciplined and eagle-eyed. They looked at the prisoners not as men, but as problems to be managed. Yet to our protagonist, this heightened security was an admission of German fear. If they had to build such a cage, it meant they knew the birds inside were still capable of flight. He began by blending in. He became the model prisoner, a ghost in the barracks who caused no trouble. This was his first layer of deception. While the guards stopped watching him closely, he began building his toolkit. In a POW camp, nothing is garbage. A discarded sardine tin became a makeshift trowel. A length of stolen copper wire became a lockpick. He realized that the most powerful weapon he possessed wasn't a gun, but his eyes. He spent months studying the guards' psychology. He noticed which guards were lazy, which ones were obsessed with their watches, and which ones could be distracted by a simple conversation or a cigarette. The second escape attempt was a masterpiece of patience. He had noticed that the camp's laundry was hauled out twice a week in large, wooden crates loaded onto a flatbed truck. He didn't just jump in a box. That was too simple. He spent weeks observing the weight checks. He realized that if he hid in a specific crate but removed an equal weight of damp uniforms, the truck's suspension wouldn't sag, and the guards at the gate wouldn't suspect a thing. On a Tuesday morning, under the cover of a thick fog, he squeezed his thin frame into the bottom of a crate, covered himself in layers of heavy, wet fabric, and waited. The heart-stopping moment came at the main gate. He heard the guards shouting, the sound of the truck's engine idling, and the heavy thud of a bayonet being poked into the crates above him to check for hollow spaces. The blade passed inches from his thigh, the cold steel vibrating against the wood. The truck lurched forward, and for the second time he tasted the air of the outside world. But being outside the wire was only half the battle. This time, he was hundreds of miles from any neutral border. He was in a land where every face was a potential enemy, and every uniform was a death warrant. He had prepared better this time. He had sewn a civilian-style jacket out of an old blanket and dyed it dark using soot from the camp's chimneys. He moved like a predator, sticking to the shadows of the Black Forest, sleeping in haystacks, and drinking from freezing mountain streams. He learned the art of the long walk, maintaining a steady, grueling pace for 20 hours a day, ignoring the blisters that turned his feet into a bloody mess. The psychological pressure was worse than the physical pain. Every time a car drove past or a dog barked in the distance, his heart would leap into his throat. He lived in a state of constant, vibrating paranoia. He managed to make it further this time, nearly 60 miles toward the Swiss border. He could almost see the peaks of the Alps on the horizon, glowing like a promise of life. But luck is a fickle mistress in wartime. While trying to cross a bridge under the cover of a moonless night, he walked straight into a random Gestapo checkpoint. They weren't looking for him specifically. They were looking for black market smugglers. But when they flashed their lights on his face and saw the haunted, hollow eyes of a man who hadn't slept in a week, they knew. They didn't even ask for papers. They just leveled their MP40s and told him to get on his knees. He was dragged back to the camp, but this time, the reception was different. The commandant was no longer amused. This prisoner was becoming an embarrassment to the invincible German administration. He was subjected to brutal interrogations, beaten until his ribs were cracked, and thrown into a cooler, a concrete box so small he couldn't stand up or lie down. They wanted to know who helped him. They wanted to know where he got his tools. He told them nothing. He sat in the dark, the pain in his body eclipsed by a single, burning thought: I got closer this time. The Nazis thought that by increasing the punishment, they would deter him. They didn't understand that for a man like him, the prison wasn't the barbed wire or the stone walls. The prison was the act of giving up. Every time they caught him, they were inadvertently training him. They were showing him their search patterns, their checkpoint locations, and their interrogation tactics. He was collecting data like a scientist. As he was marched back into the main yard after weeks of solitary confinement, the other prisoners looked at him with a mixture of pity and awe. He looked back at them and whispered a single sentence that would define the rest of the war. They have to be lucky every time. I only have to be lucky once. The score was 2-2, and the third escape was already being planned in the back of his mind. By the third time he was dragged back behind the wire, the atmosphere had shifted. He was no longer just a nameless prisoner. He was becoming a ghost in the machinery of the Third Reich. The guards looked at him with a mixture of professional frustration and a strange, growing respect. To the Nazis, order was everything. Their system was designed to be a perfect, unbreakable loop of obedience and surveillance. By escaping repeatedly, he wasn't just running away. He was insulting their ideology. They moved him again, this time to a fortress-like camp where the walls were thicker and the guards were doubled. They thought that by putting him in a cage within a cage, they could finally contain his spirit. They were wrong. They had simply provided him with a more challenging classroom. The third and fourth escapes were where his methods evolved from desperate scrambles into high-stakes psychological warfare. He realized that the best way to hide was often in plain sight. He began to study the German language with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, eavesdropping on the guards until he could mimic the harsh, rhythmic cadence of their commands. He understood that in the German army the uniform was God. If you wore the cloth of an officer, people stopped looking at your face, they looked at your rank. This realization sparked one of his most audacious plans. Through a complex network of prisoner trades, trading his meager chocolate rations from Red Cross parcels for bits and pieces of discarded clothing, he began to assemble a costume, a stolen belt, buckle here, a discarded field cap there, and a heavy wool coat that he painstakingly altered using a needle made from a fishbone. One afternoon, during the chaotic transition of the afternoon guard change, he did the unthinkable. He didn't climb a fence or dig a tunnel. He simply put on his makeshift uniform, tucked a fake wooden Luger he had carved and blackened with boot polish into his holster, and walked toward the main gate. His heart was a drum in his chest, threatening to burst through his ribs, but his face was a mask of stern Prussian discipline. As he approached the final checkpoint, the young sentry, barely 18 years old, saw the uniform, heard the sharp, barked command in German to open the gate, and instinctively snapped into a salute. He walked out the front door of a high-security prison like he owned the road. He marched for 2 miles with his shoulders squared before he finally ducked into the tree line, stripped off the hated gray wool, and vanished into the shadows. This escape lasted longer than the others. He was becoming a shadow in the heart of Germany. He learned to navigate the railway systems, clinging to the undercarriages of freight trains while the freezing wind whipped at his face and the tracks blurred inches below his head. He was learning the geography of the enemy, but the Reich was a dragnet. Every bridge had a guard, every train station had a Gestapo agent with a list of names. He was eventually caught in a routine sweep at a railway junction. The moment they realized who he was, the man who had walked out of their fortress, the retribution was swift. He was beaten until he could barely see, his face a map of bruises and dried blood. But something had changed inside him. The more they caught him, the less he feared them. He began to see the guards not as captors, but as obstacles in a game. During his 5th and 6th attempts, he became even more creative. He once swapped identities with a dying prisoner who was being moved to a lower security infirmary, only to vanish through a window the moment the guards turned their backs. Another time, he spent 3 weeks digging a tunnel with nothing but a stolen dessert spoon, moving tons of dirt in his pockets and spreading it across the exercise yard, grain by grain, just like a scene out of a movie. Each time he was caught, the walk of shame back into the camp became a victory parade in the eyes of his fellow POWs. He was showing them that the Nazis were not gods, they were men who could be fooled. The psychological toll on the German commandants was immense. One commandant reportedly sat him down in his office, poured him a glass of schnapps, and asked him plainly, "Why? Why do you keep doing this? You know we will catch you. You know you might be shot." Our protagonist looked him in the eye, took a sip of the drink, and replied, "Because every time I'm out there, even for a day, I'm winning. And every time you have to go looking for me, you're losing." It was a war of attrition. He was tying up dozens of soldiers, police dogs, and Gestapo agents who should have been at the front lines. He was a one-man sabotage mission. By his 7th capture, he was a skeletal version of the man who had surrendered in France. His body was a collection of scars, broken bones that hadn't healed quite right, and skin stretched thin over a hungry frame. But his eyes, those were different. They were sharp, bright, and filled with a terrifying level of focus. The Nazis had tried everything: solitary confinement, physical torture, the threat of the firing squad. Nothing worked. He had become the unholdable man. They moved him one last time to a camp near the Polish border, a place where the winter cold could kill a man in an hour. They thought the weather would do what their guards couldn't, but they didn't know about his secret. They didn't know that by now, he wasn't just escaping for himself anymore. He had a reason to get out that was more powerful than survival, more powerful than the British Army, and more powerful than the fear of death itself. As the snow began to fall over the barracks of the new camp, he began to look at the fence again. The score was 7-7, and he was determined to have the final word. In the cold, gray corridors of the high-security camps, most men survived on memories of a life they used to lead, faded photographs of wives in sundresses, or the remembered smell of a mother's cooking. But for our protagonist, the motivation for his most daring escapes wasn't found in the past. It was found just a few miles beyond the barbed wire. This is the chapter of his story that transforms a tale of military defiance into one of the most improbable romances of the 20th century. It began when he was moved to a labor camp near a local quarry, where the German workforce included young women from the nearby village. Among them was a girl whose eyes held a kindness that the war hadn't yet managed to extinguish. In the middle of a global massacre, amidst the filth and the cruelty of the SS, these two souls found a way to communicate, first with glances, then with whispered words, and eventually through letters smuggled in the linings of coats. She became his North Star. Suddenly, the escapes weren't just about military duty or the itch of a caged bird. They were about a desperate human need to be near her. This changed the nature of his game entirely. Before, he had escaped to get home to England. Now, he was escaping to get to her. This led to what historians can only describe as a breathtaking display of audacity: the nightly breakouts. He didn't just escape once and run for the border. He began a cycle of escaping, meeting his love under the cover of darkness, and then, impossibly, sneaking back into the camp before the morning roll call. He was treating the most feared prison system in the world like a window he could climb out of for a date. Imagine the sheer physical and mental toll of this routine. By day, he performed backbreaking labor in the quarries, his body screaming for rest. By night, while the rest of the barracks slept, he would begin the agonizing process of bypassing the security measures he had spent months studying. He knew exactly which board in the barracks floor was loose, exactly which section of the perimeter fence had a shadow that the searchlights couldn't reach, and exactly how many seconds he had between the sentry's footsteps. He would slip through the wire, navigate the dark woods, and meet her in a secluded barn or a dense thicket of trees. For a few hours, the war didn't exist. There were no uniforms, no swastikas, and no sounds of artillery, only the quiet breathing of two people who refused to let hate dictate their lives. She was his accomplice as much as his lover. At great personal risk that would have seen her sent to a concentration camp or executed for treason, she provided him with food, maps, and vital information about German troop movements. She even managed to get him civilian clothes, and most importantly, the components he needed to forge better documents. She was the reason he survived the brutal winters. When his rations were cut to nothing, she would hide bread and fruit near their meeting spot. Every time he climbed back into the camp, his heart heavy with the pain of leaving her but his stomach slightly fuller, he was carrying a secret that made him feel invincible. The guard saw a starving prisoner. He saw a man who was loved by the very people the Nazis claimed were the master race. But the stakes of this secret life were astronomical. One night, while returning from a meeting, he found the camp in a state of high alert. A random inspection had been called. The searchlights were no longer sweeping, they were fixed on the barracks. Dogs were barking, and the sound of shouting NCOs echoed off the concrete walls. He was trapped outside the wire, shivering in the dark, watching the home he had built for himself, a cage, become a death trap. If he stayed out, he would be hunted down as a deserter. If he tried to get back in and was caught, he would be executed as a spy. With the cool-headedness that had become his trademark, he waited for the precise moment a supply truck entered the gates. He clung to the underside of the vehicle, his face inches from the hot exhaust and the churning gravel, and rode it back into the heart of the camp. He slipped into his bunk, his clothes still damp with the night's dew, just seconds before the Gestapo officer kicked the door open for the count. This cycle of escaping and returning happened dozens of times. It was a dance on the edge of a razor. Each meeting with her gave him the strength to endure another day of the commandant's cruelty, but it also made the reality of the war harder to bear. He began to realize that as long as the war continued, their love was a death sentence waiting to happen. He started planning his eighth and final escape, the one that wouldn't end in a return. He wasn't just planning for himself anymore. He was planning a way to reach the advancing Allied lines so he could come back for her with an army at his back. The Nazis began to notice a change in him. He wasn't the defiant, loud-mouthed rebel anymore. He was quiet, focused, and disturbingly calm. They thought they had finally broken his spirit. They thought the hunger and the labor had finally won. They didn't realize that his silence was the sound of a man calculating the endgame. He had memorized every road, every bridge, and every German patrol route within a 50-mile radius, thanks to the information his lover had provided. He knew the Reich was crumbling. He could hear the distant, low rumble of Soviet and Allied thunder in the east and west. The seventh capture had been a setback, but the eighth escape was going to be a liberation. As he looked at the girl one last time through the fence of the quarry, he didn't say goodbye. He just touched the wire, a silent promise that the next time he left, he would stay free forever. The score was tied, but the final move belonged to the man who had turned a prison into a portal for love. The year 1945 arrived with a different kind of cold, the kind that felt like the dying breath of an empire. The air over the camp was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the distant, rhythmic thud of heavy artillery. The thousand-year Reich was collapsing, and the atmosphere inside the wire had turned toxic. The guards were no longer arrogant. They were terrified, their eyes darting toward the horizon where the Soviet and Allied fires glowed at night. For our protagonist, this was the moment he had been training for through 7 captures and years of misery. He knew that in the chaos of a retreating army, a prisoner was either a witness to be eliminated or a burden to be abandoned. He couldn't afford to wait for liberation. He had to take it. The eighth escape was not a stealthy crawl through a tunnel or a clever disguise. It was a breakout born of pure, calculated chaos. As the Allied bombers droned overhead, shattering the nearby rail hubs, the camp's hierarchy began to dissolve. Using a map he had memorized from his secret meetings with the German girl, he realized the front lines were shifting faster than the German command could track. During a massive air raid, while the guards scrambled for the bunkers and the searchlights flickered and died, he didn't run for the woods, he ran for the motor pool. This was the ultimate gamble. He knew that on the open roads, a man on foot was a target, but a man in a vehicle was just part of the retreat. He managed to hotwire a retreating officer's Kubelwagen under the cover of the smoke. With the engine roaring and his heart hammering against his ribs, he drove through the shattered gates of his 8th prison. He wasn't just escaping a camp. He was driving through the funeral of Nazi Germany. The roads were a nightmare of burning trucks, weeping civilians, and soldiers throwing away their rifles. He drove until the fuel ran out, then he walked. He walked through minefields, through ghost towns, and through the skeletal remains of a country that had tried to cage the world. When he finally saw the olive-drab uniforms of an American scouting party, he didn't hide. He stood in the middle of the road, hands raised, and yelled in English until his throat was raw. For the first time in 5 years, the hands that reached out to him didn't hold a weapon. They held a bar of chocolate and a pack of cigarettes. He was finally, truly free. Elena's for a man who had escaped 8 times, freedom was a complicated thing. While the world celebrated the end of the nightmare, his heart was still back near that quarry. As soon as the chaos settled, and he was processed by the Allied authorities, he did something that baffled his superiors. He didn't ask for a ticket home to England immediately. He asked for a jeep and a pass to return to the Soviet-occupied zone. He had a promise to keep. The journey back was a descent into a different kind of hell, the brutal, lawless landscape of post-war Germany, where the Soviet army was taking its revenge. He found the village, but the world he had left behind in the shadows of the camp was gone. The girl, his North Star, his accomplice, the woman who had kept him alive with smuggled bread and whispered hope, was caught in the gears of the new occupation. The ending of his story isn't a Hollywood sunset. It is a haunting reminder of the cost of war. He found her, but the political walls of the Cold War were already rising, higher and more impenetrable than any barbed wire the Nazis had ever strung. Despite his best efforts, despite the medals he had earned and the influence he tried to exert, the Iron Curtain descended between them. He was sent back to England, a hero of the resistance, a man whose escape record was legendary in the annals of military history. He lived a long life, married and found peace, but those who knew him said he always carried a certain look in his eyes whenever the wind blew from the east. He had beaten the Nazis 8 times, but he couldn't beat the map of a broken Europe. His legacy, however, remains unconquerable. He proved that a prison is only as strong as the prisoner's willingness to accept it. To the British military, he was a master of evasion and escape, a man who turned the act of being captured into a form of offensive warfare. To the Nazis, he was a ghost they could never quite catch, but to himself, he was simply a man who refused to be a number. He had been beaten, starved, and hunted across a continent, yet every time he was thrown back into a cell, he spent the first hour looking for the weakness in the lock. The story of the man the Nazis couldn't hold is a testament to the fact that the human spirit is the only thing in this world that cannot be manufactured or destroyed by an assembly line of tyranny. He showed that even in the darkest, most oppressive systems, a single person with enough will can create a crack in the wall. Captured 7 times, escaped 8. The math of his life was simple. He always made sure he had the last word. As the years passed and the camps were turned into museums and the barbed wire rusted away into the soil, his story remained, a flickering light in the history books, reminding us that no matter how many times life captures you, you only have to escape one more time than you are caught to be free.